wish that someone had really told me that it was okay to cry and that it was okay to feel sadness and to feel anger. I told myself all the time that I wasn't special without my eating disorder, and I didn't believe that I was deserving of anything else. This is 3 years of pent-up sadness and anger finally coming out.
Recovery not as like returning to who you were, but as a retrieval of all you lost while you were sick. That voice in your head saying you're not recovered enough is actually the biggest lie keeping you stuck. Today, we're joined by Mallary Tenore Tarpley, a journalism professor, acclaimed author, and researcher who just shattered the recovery world with one explosive discovery. She found out that 85% of people live in what she called, and we're going to discuss this, the middle place. And the recovery industry has been ignoring them. Her groundbreaking book, Slip, which you're going to see behind you, and I encourage everyone right now, before we even start the episode, trust me, my audience, trust me, go grab the book. You'll have the link below. She put the word everyone fears most right in the title, which I love. And I believe this book can change millions of people and help us all healing from eating disorders, food addiction, which everyone knows I had. And frankly, I believe any addiction. She surveyed over 700 people across 44 states and 37 countries. And what she found will blow your mind. So if you've ever felt like a failure because your recovery isn't perfect, if you've ever beaten yourself up over a slip, or if you've ever tired of the all or nothing recovery narrative, this conversation, I believe, will set you free. Mallary, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and what a lovely introduction.
Yes, yeah, I know. It's cool. And I want to kind of get into your life a little bit. And I know you were just 12 years old when anorexia entered your life. And it was less than a year after losing your mother to cancer. For our listeners battling these type of addictions, can you talk a little bit about what was happening and how you started being when you were 12?
Sure. So my mom died, as you said, of metastatic breast cancer when I was 11. And at the time, I really didn't know how to deal with her death. I thought that grief was something that you were supposed to feel and get over in a day. And I, as a perfectionist and people pleaser, thought that I should just try to be okay in the aftermath because I didn't know how else to cope. Mm-hmm. So I went to school the day after my mother died. I read her eulogy at her funeral without crying. And people were praising me for just being really strong and resilient, not knowing that I felt like I was crumbling inside. The more time passed, the farther away I felt from my mother. And I remember just wanting to stop time. I could picture the clock and just remember wanting to handcuff the arms of the clock and knowing that I couldn't. And at the same time, I was taking a 7th grade health class where we were learning about good foods and bad foods, as the teacher said. And she would tell us what we should and shouldn't eat. And though well-intentioned, it was hard for me to really understand any sort of nuance there. And I thought, I'm bad if I eat bad foods. And I realized that I could control what I looked like based on what I ate. So I began to conjure this idea that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could be closer to her. And I thought I can do that by not eating as much. So I began to restrict my food intake, not as a way of trying to be skinny, but really as a way of trying to stay small and safe. And that food restriction was almost this warped form of time travel. But within a matter of months, I very quickly ended up developing anorexia nervosa and didn't have a name for it at first, but it ended up becoming this very debilitating disorder that I struggled with for many years.
What do you think whenever you, and I know you wrote about this in the book, but a lot of addiction is us not understanding or not knowing, here you are 12 years old girl, but not knowing how to handle grief or trauma. And I know there's coping mechanisms, and that's what I use food for, is like a coping mechanism, because my parents would argue a lot and then they would make up and we were extremely poor. So like it was a big deal to go to McDonald's or Burger King. That was like the epitome of, so whenever they fight, that was the thing, take the whole family to Burger King or McDonald's. So I associated in my mind, if I like arguing or whatever, everything's good, everything's fine, everything's happy if I eat bad food. And then, of course, being extremely poor, we lived off of cereals and all of those different things. Whenever you look at what happened to you and that trauma and that grief that you had, do you feel like, because a lot of people would look at it and say, like, why does that even correlate? But do you believe this is the way your prefrontal cortex or whatever was he able to handle the grief or trauma, or that was a way that you stuffed it down or unprocessed it, if that makes sense?
It was. And I always wanted to just please the people around me. When I was younger, I really wanted to please my mother first and foremost. And with her gone, I really looked toward other maternal role models, and teachers very much played that role for me. I was lucky in that I had a lot of teachers, including the health teacher, who really looked after me after my mother died. And I remember just really taking the health teacher's comments to heart. This idea that we weren't supposed to be living in larger bodies because that was bad in her eyes, and we weren't supposed to eat junk food or things that were deemed unhealthy. And so I very quickly internalized that and thought, I want to please her. I want to eat all the right foods, and I need to stay small. And that, coupled with this idea of wanting to stop time, made me really think about these connections, which seems crazy. It's not as though I just sat down one day and said, this is what I'm going to do, and connected all the pieces. But even looking at journal entries that I still have from that time, it was very clear that I was smart enough to know that I wanted to stay small. And I, at the time, thought that was a good thing, especially in the eyes of teachers. So there was a lot at play there, and that sense of control too, and being able to control what I ate was part of it. I liked knowing that I could control my kind of limited food intake, because I couldn't control anything that happened to my mother when the cancer metastasized to her bone marrow and her liver and her brain. But I found some comfort in knowing that I could control what I put into mine. So I think sometimes control just gets almost stereotyped to the point where we just say, oh, everyone's eating disorder has to do with them just wanting control. And it's often far more complicated than that. But certainly control can be a factor in the development of an eating disorder, and was for me.
What do you wish someone had told you as a 12-year-old girl?
I wish that someone had really told me that it was okay to cry, and that it was okay to feel sadness and to feel anger. A lot of times, though well-intentioned, we may tell children, oh, don't feel sad or don't feel angry. A lot of times, girls in particular are told that anger is a bad feeling to have, because in so many ways, I just felt like I wanted someone to love me and care for me in that aftermath. And even though I had a supportive father and grandparents, I still was craving a sort of care that entailed some sort of permission to feel those feelings. And it wasn't until I got sick that I actually got that care and attention, where people said, oh, something is wrong. We need to get you help because you look really sick. And so the eating disorder in that way served that purpose. But I think we need to be really mindful of the fact that we should encourage children to feel emotions, because we do know that over time, those suppressed emotions can lead some children to develop an eating disorder, particularly in the aftermath of a trauma.
Yeah, and I know you spent 17 months in residential treatment and you had 5 hospitalizations. What do you think the biggest lie that you told yourself during those years that kept you sick?
I told myself all the time that I wasn't special without my eating disorder. And I really thought it was my eating disorder that made me special. For so long, my mom was that person who made me feel that way. And in her absence, the eating disorder in some ways stepped in and convinced me that the only way I could be special was if I was anorexic. Because of that, essentially ended up revolving my entire life around the eating disorder, to the part where I no longer just said that I had anorexia. I began to say, I am anorexic. And I didn't believe that I was deserving of anything else. I looked back at my old journals from the time, and there was this one line that broke my heart looking back on it, but it said, I don't deserve the light. And I remember that I would write these journal entries in which I would have conversations with my eating disorder, and I would literally write them in the dark because I didn't think I was deserving of anything more. So I wish I could have told myself, you are special, you deserve the light, you're so much more than your disorder.
Do you feel like that was because you witnessed like your mother passing on? Is that where did the I'm not special come from?
So it was losing my mom in a lot of ways. Even though I did have a small but supportive family, I just felt I had spent so much of my life just with my mother and trying to please my mother. My mother had a temper. And so very often, if my parents got into arguments, I would side with my mother because I was afraid that she would really yell if I didn't. And so I felt like I was always trying to please her. And when I made her happy, that made me feel so special. And I also felt like my mom just understood me in so many different ways. And so there was this feeling from her that I got that I didn't receive from anybody else. And when she died, I lost that feeling. And there was obviously the void of her death, but then also that void in terms of how she made me feel. And that void of realizing that I was now a motherless daughter, like I was a daughter without a mother. And so in many ways, the eating disorder kind of stepped in and filled that void temporarily, even though it also took so much away from me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've talked to a lot of people that had situations with cancer and anger. Whenever you began to, were you a fearful child? Was there always fear? Was it everything fear-based?
I wouldn't say everything was fear-based. I certainly was afraid of losing things, which is somewhat ironic now as I think about it, because my disorder was all about loss and losing weight. Whenever I would lose anything as a child, my mother would get so upset with me. I just became very fearful of loss, whether it was losing my retainer in the school cafeteria or losing a piece of jewelry my mother had given me or losing a toy. I remember just trying to hide that loss because I was fearful of how she would react. And when she inevitably would find out, oftentimes she would yell, and she really just had a temper in those situations. It was interesting looking back as I wrote this book and just recognizing that fear of loss and then seeing just how that was so amplified once I lost my mother.
Yeah, because a lot of times being in a childhood like that, if there's a lot of arguing or one of the parents have anger, then there's that fear, like you said, the fear hits as a child and you don't know what to do, so you people please, which was what you were talking about. I find that interesting. As far as like biggest lie, what I was talking about, a lot of people have self-deception, especially with their addiction. They feel like, oh, I can function, or I'm good, or I'm not as bad as this person. They tell those lies to themselves. When did you begin to be self-aware? What was that moment where you started to gain some truth?
So I would say that there was not one pivotal moment or turning point. It was really a slow accumulation of conversations that I had once I was hospitalized. So when I was at Boston Children's Hospital, I was on the medical unit 2 times and then the psychiatric ward 3 times. It was during those psychiatric ward stays that I started to just do a lot more writing. I was keeping journals, but then I was also using these therapy workbooks that the staffers created for me. They knew it was easier for me to actually process things through the written word because I've always identified as a writer dating back to when I was 5 years old. So they would oftentimes just write out questions for me, and then I would write my responses out, and then we would talk about them. And I still have those therapy workbooks. I fortunately have access to just so much rich source material from my past, which I was able to use when writing the book. But I remember there was this one staffer in particular named Glenn, and I wanted to interview him for the book, but he passed away a few years ago, and I didn't get to talk with him. But there was a part where we were talking about how I didn't want to grow up, and I was scared about growing up without my mother. I thought, if growing up means living without my mom, I want to stay little forever. And there was this one particular part where Glenn said, unscramble this. And there was this jumble of letters, and then he put these dashes underneath it, and I had to unscramble it. And in my handwriting, I saw the unscrambled text, which said, growing up is inevitable. And
Right.
I remember in that moment just thinking, ugh, I can't stop this. I need to be able to figure out, how do I move forward and not just try to stay so tethered to the past, because in staying so deeply rooted in the past, I'm not able to really get beyond this eating disorder. So that didn't change everything by any stretch of the imagination, but it created some awareness that made me at least start to feel a little bit more curious about what would it look like if I weren't so wrapped up in this eating disorder.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so you began to have self-awareness then. How old were you when you began to really feel like you had an understanding of what was going on?
I would say I was about 15 years old. So that was when I was in residential treatment. And fortunately, I was there for a year and a half, which is almost unheard of by today's standards. Typical residential stays are a lot shorter. And my public school system and Department of Mental Health in the state of Massachusetts, where I lived, they paid for my treatment. And so that was why I was able to actually stay in treatment for that long. But it was there that I really finally began to grieve my mother's loss and was able to experience feelings of sadness and rage. I have this one part in the book where I talk about how I just went into this padded timeout room at the residential treatment facility, and I was given a huge stack of telephone books, and my therapist had provided them for me. And I ripped up all of these telephone books and I tore out all the pages, and my skin was just all covered in black ink afterward. And then there was a staff member there who had this pad, and she encouraged me to just punch it. And I punched it almost until my knuckles were bloody, which was so uncharacteristic of me because I never showed anger. And my therapist gave me a dozen eggs, which I then threw against the outer wall of the building. And that was this moment where I thought, oh my gosh, this is 3 years of pent up sadness and anger finally coming out, right? Because it had been 3 years since my mother had died. And so that awareness and that ability to start grieving is a large part of what helped me to recover. Certainly, I had to really work through the disordered behaviors around food and exercise, and had to really work through all of the distorted thoughts I had around my body. But I was also surprised by how much grieving and grief work I had to do as part of my recovery. And that created a lot of awareness for me around how I could live my life without the disorder, and how I could begin to see the disorder not as the solution to the problem, but really as the problem itself.
That's interesting. I interviewed somebody here a few weeks ago about their father being a drug abuser and what that was like in the home as a child. One of the things that he said, and I'm wondering if this has to relate with you, he said that he blamed himself because if he was better or if he was good enough or if he could be the perfect child, then this wouldn't have happened. And I noticed you used the word perfectionism when we first were communicating. Did you ever have those thoughts where if I wasn't this way or if I'd have been more perfect, my mom would still be alive? Did that correlation ever hit?
That did. I have some journal entries where I actually talked about how I thought that I had killed my mother. And it's interesting because I don't remember always feeling that way. But I do have those entries where I wrote about that, but I had no proof for that, right? There was nothing that I had done to my mother that would have done that. But I thought sometimes that in those moments where I quietly gave up hope internally, then maybe that somehow led to her not being able to make it. Because externally as a family, we always said, she's going to be better, she's going to be fine, she's going to make it. But at times I would have these little moments of doubt that I was so afraid to ever speak about them. And I thought sometimes that maybe those thoughts were somehow contributing to my mother's sickness, because at the time there was a whole lot of toxic positivity going on societally. It was this idea that if you just think you're going to get better, then you will. This is all about mindset. That was very common in the 1990s. And I write about this in the book. So I was fearful of those sort of doubts that crept in. Also, when I was sick with anorexia, I remember I was staying with my grandparents for the summer because my father was just having a really hard time managing me at home. And my grandfather had a heart attack during that time. And I very distinctly remember thinking, oh, I caused this because he is so stressed out by seeing me so sick. And so there was a lot of blame there that happened, even though it wasn't quite rational. Looking back, it makes sense as a 11, 12, 13-year-old that I would have blamed myself.
No, that makes sense. I want to get into the book because I want to make sure we focus on this because I think it's super important, and that's the middle place. I believe it's a revolutionary framework, and it's something, and I know you discovered that 85% of people exist in this middle place, yet no one really talks about it. And I know the recovery world, Dwayne and I talk about this all the time. It's obsessed with this myth that it's like abstinence or nothing. Like it's almost a perfectionist mentality. Maybe you can go into the framework a little bit. And then also, how do you think it keeps people sick?
Yeah. So, especially in the eating disorder field, there is this push for full recovery for everyone. And certainly there are folks I've interviewed who are fully recovered. They consider themselves to be. So, I don't want to discredit that narrative. But it's problematic if we say that everyone can and should fully recover, because it is really ignoring the fact that eating disorders for some can be chronic, and for others, it can remain very much a vulnerability. And for so long, I tried to reach this gold standard of full recovery after I left treatment. And in my mind, it felt like this very perfectionistic ideal because I really didn't have a good definition of it. No one exactly told me what full recovery meant. And so I equated it with eating perfectly, exercising just the right amount, getting all A's, doing all the extracurriculars, not having to go to therapy. That's really what I thought of as full recovery. And then lo and behold, 2 years later in freshman year of college, I relapsed and I began to fall into this very vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting. And at that moment in time, I felt like I was both failing at anorexia and failing at full recovery for many years, just so ashamed to let people know that I was falling back into kind of sickness. And so I continued to tell people I was fully recovered because I didn't want to be anything but. So there was this real disconnect between my own lived reality and the story that I shared with the rest of the world. And this has really proven true for a lot of people because for a long time, I thought I was the only one kind of in this place. And it took me a while to get to this terminology of the middle place. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s when I was working with journalists and I was helping them to tell what we called restorative narratives, which are stories that show how people and communities make meaningful pathways forward in the aftermath of trauma. And they're stories that really delve deep into the messy middle. And so it occurred to me in working with journalists that this could be a really helpful framework for my own story. And I thought, what if rather than looking at every slip as grounds for failure, I could really reframe my thinking and consider the fact that slips could be opportunities for growth. Because when I was binge eating and restricting, every time I would eat the carton of ice cream, for instance, I would say, I slipped. I might as well eat the sleeve of cookies and then eat the bag of chips and everything in the mini fridge. And then the next day I'll just restrict, right? And it was every slip just turned into a slide. Once I began to reframe my thinking around slips, I was then able to normalize slips as an important part of the recovery process. And I was able to say, maybe these slips are just things I'm going to have to contend with, but I can think about them really as opportunities to get back up rather than thinking that they're always going to kick me back down. So I began to define this middle place really as this gray space between acute sickness and full recovery. And it's this place where slips happen, but progress is always possible. And that framework really helped me to get out of that vicious cycle and to make meaningful progress forward. I will just say too that this space has long been stigmatized in the eating disorder field to the point where there are these terms known as quasi-recovery and pseudo-recovery. And they are terms that describe people like me who are not fully recovered, but who aren't sick. But these terms can be really pernicious because they make people feel like their recovery is not real or that they're somehow faking it. And the reality is so many people live their lives out in the middle place. It's not just a temporary space. And so it's really important that we acknowledge that there is this gray space. And it's, again, a space where hope and hardship can coexist. And I think that there's real beauty in expanding the ways we talk about recovery, because if we only think about it in black and white terms of acute sickness or full recovery, then we're really overlooking a whole population of people who don't fit into those categories. So a big part of the middle place framework is really trying to be more inclusive of people and where they're at in their own recovery journeys.
No, I love that. And what, if you don't mind, with the relapse, because I always find it interesting when I talk to people, did you have, or do you have issues like when it comes to relationships, like not being good enough? Like here you are in college and you relapse. What was the trigger?
So the trigger for me was multifaceted. Part of it was just this pressure of trying to maintain full recovery.
Mm.
Because I was trying to be so perfect at it, it just felt like the pressure of that was insurmountable. And that was part of it. Also, I've always been a perfectionist with my schoolwork and with work in general. So I was trying to do really well in classes. And the reality is that I essentially missed 2.5, almost 3 years of high school when I was in treatment. But I took classes when I was in the hospital and residential treatment, but they were quite rudimentary. And so I wasn't really learning a whole lot, but I still did get credit for those classes. But it did make college a lot harder for me. So I wanted to get all A's. And so the pressure of that was quite difficult. And then also, my father had told me freshman year of college that he was going to be getting remarried. So that was a big trigger for me because I did not want him to get remarried.
You had 85% of the survey that you sent out. And I want people to understand your background a little bit. Can you go into how you approach the book with that mindset of a journalism? And then, if you don't mind, and let them know what you do and how you're a journalist.
I am a journalism professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm a journalist by trade. So I have a background in journalism, and I still publish a lot of stories, largely around mental health and motherhood and eating disorders. So when I set out to write this book, I initially did conceive of it as being a memoir that would really just look at my own story as a woman who has had lived experience with anorexia and who lives in the middle place. But the more I thought about the book and what I wanted it to accomplish, the more I realized that I could really use my journalistic skills to enhance the book and the overall message that I was trying to convey. And so I thought about the fact that I, in many ways, fit the stereotypical image of someone with an eating disorder, in that I am a woman, I live in a smaller body, I identify as, someone who's in middle to upper class. And so that is often what people think of when they think of someone with an eating disorder. So I really wanted to include perspectives from a diversity of people from all different races and ethnicities and body types and genders and socioeconomic classes. And that was important to me, both to dispel the misconception that these are only young white teenage girl issues, but also to really broaden people's scope of understanding around just how toxic these disorders can be and how pervasive they are. So I ended up launching a survey that reached, as you said, over 700 people from around the world. And that was incredibly helpful for me because so many of those individuals said that they were willing to be interviewed. So I ended up interviewing dozens and dozens of those survey respondents. And I also interviewed lots of researchers and clinicians. All said and done, I interviewed about 175 people. And I really was fascinated by just all of the research that has been done in the eating disorder field since I was treated in the late 90s, early 2000s. We know so much more now about these disorders than we once did. Even though funding for eating disorders is notoriously low, we still know a lot more. And so I was really keen on figuring out how to marry my own personal narrative alongside the narratives of others, alongside research. And so fortunately, I was able to use my writing and journalistic skills to put that together in a way that felt seamless, in a way that would really help people with lived experience to feel seen and heard, but also in a way that would help the average person who may not have an eating disorder, or even medical doctors and educators, to really better understand the nuances of these disorders and the recovery process.
Yeah, I don't know if you went into, as far as eating disorder, when it comes to class. Like for me, I was raised super poor, was homeless for a period of time and everything else. So it was this whole idea of scarcity, everything's scarce. And then the only thing that gives me satisfaction, I didn't want to do drugs or alcohol. So the next best thing was sugar and binging on 12 donuts, or I would steal some food from whatever it was. Did you find that to be, because it's interesting what you're saying, let's say upper middle class white teenager is starving herself to death, and then 15-year-old Jason living in he's trying to eat as much food as he can.
Yes. So it is interesting because there is an eating disorder. It's a lot of times this pendulum swing where people move from binge eating to restricting. And this weaning motion actually tends to be quite common among people who are dealing with food insecurity because they may experience these fluctuations in their food availability, which leads to this sort of feast or famine cycle. Research in the book, which shows that restriction during times of scarcity can lead to binges once food is available. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that food insecurity contributes to weight stigma and binge eating disorder in adults. We are now beginning to see more research that is looking at eating disorders among people in lower socioeconomic classes. And it's important because it's helping us to realize that eating disorders really don't discriminate, and they are not just an eating disorder that affects affluent women.
Yeah, no, I know obesity. I know there's a lot of, like for me, I would obviously eating that much food. I didn't purge. I would eat so much that I would throw up because I'm eating. If you eat 12 to 18 Krispy Kreme donuts, it's going to make you sick. And so I would do that. That was my thing. Or run through the drive-through and eat 4 Big Macs. But I just kept gaining weight. I just kept getting bigger and bigger. Do you think like male to female, as far as that goes, do you think it's like for me, I never thought to be bulimic or anything like that or not eat. My whole thing was just eat. Do you think there's a male-female thing with this?
So we do see that certainly men struggle with eating disorders, which is not talked about enough. And those percentages of males struggling with eating disorders do tend to be higher when we look at binge eating disorder versus anorexia and bulimia. Certainly men struggle with anorexia and bulimia, but we see higher levels with binge eating disorder. I don't think that the percentages we have are always accurate because there are many men who struggle, but they don't seek help, especially if they're dealing with anorexia because they're afraid to admit that they have what has commonly been referred to as a woman's disorder. So there are many people who are not really captured in those statistics. So I think realistically, there's probably a lot more people. Right now, we say about 25% of people with anorexia are male and closer to 30 to 35% of people with binge eating disorder are male. But again, it's hard to say definitively if those are actually accurate statistics. We do know that eating disorders often tend to be more prevalent in women, but again, they really don't discriminate. We see folks who are transgendered, we see males, we see females struggling with all different types of eating disorders.
Yeah, I know your book is called Slip, and you mentioned a little bit about it, but it's not called Success or Healed or any of those things. So I really like the title, and it's a word that everyone fears, and it's right there bold on your book. How are you redefining? And you went a little bit into this, but I want to gain some clarity on what the specific of what is a slip actually mean.
So I really wanted to be bold with this title. I wanted to think about how could I really stop people in their tracks with this title. Initially, I was going to title the book The Middle Place, but then I was at a writing retreat with one of my favorite authors, a woman named Dani Shapiro, and we started brainstorming different titles. And I was talking with her about slips, and she said, "What about slip?" And I thought, that's a really good title. But it's interesting because as I was interviewing people for the book, there was one clinician who very defiantly said, "I would not title your book Slip." She said, "That has a really negative connotation in our field, and people are probably going to look down on that." And I thought, that's precisely the point, right? I want to change that narrative, and I want to remove the stigma that so often comes with this word slip, because slips are a normal part of the recovery process. And if we deny that reality, then we are going to just keep people rooted in silence and in shame. We need to really remove that shame so that we can empower people to actually talk about their slips and to speak truth to them. Not with shame, but with curiosity. This is something I do a lot now where instead of just thinking that every slip is going to lead to a slide, I try to look at the slip and say, okay, that slip happened. That's okay. But why did it happen? Who can I talk to about it? And how do I get back up now? Not a week from now once I'm through my big deadlines, not a month from now once the kids go back to school, whatever it might be. But how can I do it right now? Because it's so easy to just keep putting that off. I also think it's really important to recognize that slips are not a bad thing a lot of the time, right? If you think about that very word slip, it suggests some sort of forward movement. So many of us actually slip when we are trying to do really hard things, right? You can't slip if you're standing still. So I know from my own experiences that a lot of times when I'm trying to make these great choices in service of recovery, it's really hard. And sometimes I slip in the midst of that. But rather than fixating on the slip and demonizing it, I think, okay, that was to be expected in some ways. I'm going to give myself grace and I'm going to figure out how do I get back up from this. So that reframing can be really helpful, particularly for folks with eating disorders who do tend to be very perfectionistic. Research shows that is a very common temperament trait among those with eating disorders, especially anorexia. So to tell people that they shouldn't slip, or to tell people that slips are only a part of the early stages of the recovery process, are really harmful when we think about the fact that often folks receiving these messages are going to internalize that and think that they're failing if they're falling anything short of perfection.
Yeah, that's so good. And you use the S word, shame, which I always like to address, because in reality, slips can happen so easily. Like, for instance, here you are stressed out, you skip a lunch and dinner, and now if you want to call it a micro slip, you're like, oh, I didn't eat because I was stressed. It can be that. And there also can be, like, for me, it could be like, oh, why did I have an IPA burger and fries? I never eat that. Oh, I was trying to really think about this and I was upset about that. So slips and shame, like this perfectionist attitude, how do you reframe it? And I know you talk about this in the book, as opportunities for growth.
Yeah. So part of growth has to do with just owning where we're at in our recovery. So many times people will say that they're fully recovered when they're not. This I heard time and time again as I was interviewing people with lived experience. And they, again, were too afraid to say that they weren't fully recovered. But what happens is that then every single slip just gets shrouded in secrecy because individuals think, I'm not supposed to be having these slips. I'm supposed to be over my disorder. So there's no way I can tell people about this because then they're going to think that I'm a fraud. And a big part of this is looking at these slips as opportunities for growth as we talk about our standing in the middle place. So these two things go hand in hand, where the more we can be open about where we're at in our recovery, and the more we can courageously say, yes, I'm in this middle place, then it gives us the permission to be able to talk more freely about our slips that won't cause alarm with our loved ones, right? Because if you've told your loved ones all along you're fully recovered and then you start talking about all these slips, they're going to think, wait a minute, what's going on? Whereas if you tell them I'm in this middle place, my disorder is still a vulnerability, I am still working on my recovery, then it opens up these opportunities for conversation where you can talk about those slips and then grow from that experience, right? Where you are honestly sharing those slips, you're thinking through why they happened with someone else, and that someone else could be a therapist, it could be a dietitian for those of us in eating disorder recovery, it could be your husband or wife or friend. For me, it's my husband. He's the one day to day who I talk to, but I also do see a therapist and dietitian. And so I have made so much more progress in my recovery since I started really openly talking about being in the middle place, and since I have found the strength to really be open about my slips.
That's awesome. I want to kind of get into something controversial, the role of diet culture. What did you find out in your book about diet culture?
So diet culture is so pervasive to the point where we often don't recognize that we are consuming diet culture messages. Researchers have found that the vast majority of people in our society have some level of discontent with their bodies. And researchers refer to this as normative discontent. So it's actually more the norm than the exception to feel bad about our bodies. I remember thinking that this was quite fascinating when I learned about this. And very often it's because of diet culture, because we live in a society that is constantly feeding us messages that we should live in a smaller body, we should take up less space, and that our weight really determines our worth. And those messages may not be as overt as I just said them right now, but they're often these underlying messages that we see when we are following wellness or fitness gurus, right? Or when we look at sort of ads for weight loss. And there's just so much of this messaging to the point where it often makes us feel like we're the problem, We
Right.
even see this in marketing, right? Where it's an advertisement for weight loss or an advertisement even for a skincare product that's supposed to work wonders. If it doesn't work wonders on us, then we think that we're the problem, right? Because it's not the product, it's us. And so we internalize so many of these messages, which we see on social media, we see them on the TV, we hear them on the radio. Even when I was streaming a movie recently on Disney Plus with my two kids who are 7 and 9, a bunch of ads for GLP-1 drugs came on. And I said, I'm not demonizing these drugs. They can be helpful for some, but I use it as an opportunity to talk with my kids about the fact that there are some people who take these drugs and that's their choice, but you're going to hear lots of different advertisements throughout your life about weight loss, and they're going to try to make you believe that you need to live in a smaller body in order to be loved and accepted. And I don't want you to grow up believing that. So I know I can't dismantle diet culture, but I do try to defy it in some ways and call it out, both for my own sake, but also for my kids' sake.
Yeah, it's always amazing too, because the people that they're showing as the epitome of health are using illegal drugs, whether it's female or male. Our other host, he's a bodybuilder. And eating disorders are huge in bodybuilding. And you can talk to bodybuilders and they'll tell you as far as like weighing like little tiny grams and then what they do to themselves before the shows and they're passing out or they've been having so many deaths on stage and stuff like that. Now women are dying pretty regularly every year from bodybuilding, and it's just a lack of calories and not eating and getting yourself so dehydrated. So you can even see, so the epitome of health and fitness and what we view as like perfect is super sick too.
It really is. Yeah. We have such distorted views about what it means to be healthy and well. And it's compounded by the fact that we see people living out these lacquered lives on social media where everything seems shiny and bright. But if only we could scroll behind those pictures and see what actually is happening behind the scenes, we would realize that there's a big disconnect likely between what we see and what these people's lives are really like.
100%. And I know you define recovery not as like returning to who you were, but as a retrieval of all you lost while you were sick, like pleasure, possibility, and then some type of peace. Can you paint a picture of what that retrieval looks like in real life?
Yes. So that retrieval for me has been largely about trying to reconnect with the parts of myself that are not outside the disorder. And this can be really helpful for anyone who's in recovery to recognize that at one point in time, the disorder may have taken up your entire life and identity. And if you think about your identity as a pie, it may have really taken up all the spaces, all the slices in that pie. But for me, as I think about recovery now, I recognize that the eating disorder is still taking up a slice of the pie. It's a decent sized slice, but there's so many other slices in that pie, right? And I've had to work on retrieving those slices of my identity as I've gotten better. So reconnecting, for instance, with my love for writing, right? Because when I was sick, I wrote in my journals, but I wasn't writing about anything besides my eating disorder. Or reconnecting with my love for reading. I remember that was a sign that I was actually making progress in recovery, where I could read a Harry Potter book, because I grew up loving writing or reading, but then when I was sick, I just could not concentrate on it. Another slice of the pie for me now is being a mom, right? Being a wife, being a professor, and really thinking about how do I continue to retrieve those parts and really build out those parts of my identity so that I'm not putting all of my mental energy, all my physical energy into sort of feeding the slice of the pie that is the eating disorder. It's a big part of just this idea that recovery is really a ruthless commitment to hard work and this accumulation of slow steps, with an acceptance that sometimes those steps are going to lead to slips. So that's a big part of it for me too.
Yeah, we have just two more questions. But this one is, what does more recovery look like on a day when full recovery feels impossible?
Yes. So I love this idea of more recovery because I think more recovery over time can lead to a fuller life. But for me, it often has to do with just really little choices that I'm making day to day. I struggled a lot with obsessive exercising when I was acutely sick, and there are still lingering effects of that where I find that I don't think I've done a good enough job exercising unless I've gone for a die-hard run. But there are moments and days when I am just really tired, right? Because I've gotten up super early or my kids were up all night. And in those moments, being able to say, I'm just going to take a slow walk, or maybe even I'm not going to exercise today. That for me is a choice in service of more recovery. Or something like when I'm at the grocery store and I look at the many different options for loaves of bread, and I'm really tempted to buy the thin slice, low calorie bread instead of the full slice bread. And there are times when I'll reach for that 60 calorie thin slice bread and I put it in the shopping cart, and then I walk around the store and I keep thinking about how I should have gotten the regular bread. And sometimes I still do just get the thin slice bread. But there have been times as well where I go back to that shelf and I just put back the thin sliced bread and get the regular sliced bread. So I mentioned this, it's very specific, right? And we each have our own specific moments that illustrate this idea of more recovery. For me, grabbing that regular bread, that's a choice in service of more recovery. The more I can do that, the more progress I can make in this middle place. And that for me is really important because I never want this middle place to be a space where I'm settling for stagnancy. I really want to recognize that it's a hard place to be, but part of why it's hard is because I'm always trying to make progress in this place.
No, that's so good. I love that. Those are such great words. If there's one core message that you could whisper into the ear of every person listening who's struggling maybe with their relationship with food or their body, maybe even battling shame, feeling like they're not recovered enough, what would it be?
I would say that recovery really is a lifelong pursuit. So often it is framed as a fixed state and something that we cross into where there's this finish line and then we're done. But if we really want to grow as humans, if we want to be better people, I think it's always helpful to think about how do we keep moving forward and how do we look at recovery as this ongoing process that we have to be really mindful of so that we can give ourselves grace when we slip and so that we're not thinking of ourselves as failures. So that takes courage, right? Because we live in a society that really prefers narratives with protagonists who prevail and who triumph over their disorders. But finding that courage to just recognize the ongoingness of recovery and to speak truth to that is something that will really benefit us all.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I know what you shared today isn't just revolutionary. To me, it's deeply healing. And I appreciate you and thank you for the courage to put the word slip in the title. I know everyone told you not to do that because I think it validates the 85% of us, which your research showed, that are living in this beautiful, messy middle place. And your research, what I got out of it, didn't just give us data, but it gave us permission to be human in our recovery. And that's what we are. So it gave me permission to have a bad day and still let myself know that I'm still recovering and that there's more recovery that's happening in my life. So it kind of gives you permission to see a slip as growth instead of this shame and failure. And to everyone's listening, Mallary's book, Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, is out. When this episode comes out, it'll be out. It's Simon & Schuster. I'm begging each of you to get the book, whether you're struggling with food, substances, or any addiction. Mallary just handed you a roadmap to freedom. Thank you, Mallary.
Thank you so much for having me.